Hey, thank you. Okay, hello Product School. I am Jen Sheldon. I currently work at Elephant, which is a design agency. Our client is Apple, so I'm actually embedded at Apple where I'm leading product management for a new platform. That's about all I can tell you because we're under NDA. But I can tell you that I've been a product manager for these companies, and I'm happy to discuss anything after this presentation if you're curious. Today, I wanted to talk about cultivating product innovation. And that's kind of a broad topic. But specifically, I wanted to discuss a couple things that are really fun. The design sprint, the discovery sprint, which some people think of discovery as design. There are slight differences from my perspective, and I'm happy to go into those nuances. And I'll give you a case study where we dealt with both design sprints and discovery sprints. And the reason that I want to talk about this today is because I'm really excited to be here. It's important for me to give back to the community because I've learned so much just from speaking to people casually, meeting other product managers along the way. And so this is my opportunity to help you. So I'm talking about things that really excite me, and I hope they excite you too. So I guess I just want to say, most people who have found their way into product management or a product management role love building things. Just actualizing an idea, going from a sketch to creating something that helps people is an incredible experience. I'm wondering how many people are product managers in the room right now? Okay, that's like almost half, it seems like. So you know what it's like to create something from scratch, hopefully, with people. Is that sort of true? Okay. So that's great. And I think that's what this is all about today. I'm going to go through frameworks both for design sprints and discovery sprints that really help get your team involved and hopefully lead to a transformative experience for your team and the product. So, okay. So, design sprints. Design sprints are really popular. They're a popular format these days for product discovery. The idea, though, to collaboratively define which product or features to build in a structured, time-boxed way is not radically new. With design thinking in particular, a similar approach was developed 25 years ago. So this is not a new idea. However, Google Ventures has done some tremendous research recently, and this is the book that I'm going to reference. Basically, what they've come up with a easy-to-follow format for the design sprint, and it's been tested in hundreds of sprints. And so this is kind of de rigueur right now. People are using this framework a lot. So this is like the main reference point, but the frameworks that I'm going to go through are ones that I've used, and I'm happy to discuss further. So essentially, a design sprint is a shortcut to learning, but without building and launching. So if your general idea is if your general idea of a sprint is to go from idea, if your general idea is to go from idea, build, launch, and learn, we've just got a little shortcut here. In a design sprint, you make tangible solutions. You test them in context, and you involve the entire team. The team gains artifacts, knowledge and alignment, and they gain it fast, and they gain it together, and that's sort of the important part here. So, when does a design sprint happen? It can kick off the definition of your product or create a shared vision. It can unblock your product when the road gets a little bumpy or you reach an impasse with different people in your group. And design sprints can really catalyze your development process. So when things are going slowly with developers, sometimes this is a great way to get alignment with everybody. So who do you bring to a design sprint? This is really a cross-functional team effort. So that means everybody, all roles, different roles working on product should be involved in a design sprint. The point of this is just to get everybody's point of view and to harness the talents of your team. So a typical example, beyond, usually there's a core group that's your product manager, your engineers, your designer, maybe a subject matter expert, like if you're building content, maybe your content lead. But you need to include some stakeholders, and you also need to include a sprint master who is not the product manager, and that's the person who's driving. And we can get into that a little further if you want. Okay, so the design sprint methodology is it looks something like this, and I'm going to get into it a little bit deeper. So it shares this double diamond methodology that has been in the design community for a really long time. The double diamond approach refers to two separate stages. This is basically all right, so you'll see. The reason that I'm a little bit nervous, I'm sorry, I'm going to back up. Okay, so you'll see this double diamond methodology through all of design sprints, and I'll talk about the rest in a bit. But basically, the first one is the problem space, and the second stage is the solution space. And the reason we're talking about a double diamond is it's talking about there's an opening phase for both of these. And for the first one in the problem space, you're collecting insights. And in the second stage, in the solution space, you're collecting ideas. But there's an opening phase followed by a closing phase, right? Or a narrowing phase. So here you're all open, you're thinking about insights, and then you close by defining the problem. In the solution space, you open up again and you collect as many ideas as you possibly can, and you close by hypothesizing on one solution, or coming up with a solution that you're actually going to test with real users. So you might hear about like the wavy process. I like the double diamond approach myself. This continues in the third stage, which is the development space. And there the opening phase is really where you're developing and you're refining. And the closing phase is when you evaluate with users. You basically get an answer. So this is the methodology that I'm going to talk about a lot. And I think the important thing is just to know that there's opening and closing phases. And the practice of the design sprint is typically a 5-day sprint. So this is and it's broken down typically this way, where the last 2 days are development and the first 3 are kind of cut in half, where you're working on your problem and defining it, and working on your solution, building it. There are variations to this process. The classic is the 5-day, but I've heard of quick 3-day sprints, and unfortunately, the 3-day sprints are usually broken down in the bottom picture, which means that they cut off the development. So I've seen this a lot. I've worked in several different companies, and I think people talk about a design sprint that they want to do, but then they don't actually build anything at the end. And I think building something is really important, and we're going to talk about that some more, but this is just what I've seen out in the wild doing product management. So the goal, this is really important. You use design sprints to rapidly apply learning. That's what all this waviness is about. This is why you're like aligning everybody from all the different roles. You need to learn together, because that shared learning will inform your product, your feature, and hopefully your company. I'm going to go through the frameworks for each of these different phases that have been useful to me right now. And so we'll just start with understanding, then defining, diverging, deciding, prototyping, and validating. So understanding. So a few frameworks that, you're probably familiar with user interviews, which is a thing that you should be doing all the time as a product manager, is talking to your potential users and gathering knowledge about the problem space. A concierge test is a really fun one. This is something that you can do where sometimes there are a lot of constraints around actually talking to users. You can't actually build something, so you have a conversation where you actually act as the concierge and you do whatever your potential customer wants you to do. This is kind of an interesting game. Lightning talks is a great way to understand really the problem space that you're working on. lightning talks are usually given by subject matter experts in your field, and it's a great way to just sort of inject great information into the entire team. Okay, so I also want to mention that there's a note-taking structure that really accompanies the whole design sprint, and the most popular format is How Might We? Have you guys heard of this one? It's just a way to take notes on Post-its. I know Post-its are highly specific, but you'll see how this sort of plays out in later phases of the sprint. But essentially, this is just a structure like as you're learning about the problem space, you capture notes thinking about how might we, like how is solution oriented, like how can we do something. Might is optimistic, thinking that this is possible. This is an important mindset to have. And the we part is collaborative. You need to think about all of the talents and the possibilities within your team. And it's just a great way to think while you're learning from lightning talks, while you're learning from your users. And it helps in the define stage. Okay, so in the define stage, a very typical thing that I'm sure you've seen a million times is where you're sharing ideas and mapping affinities. So this is where your how might we notes come into play. Each team member will share their how might we notes, and then you kind of group them together into a structure, and this is something that you leave. You kind of leave on your wall as part of the design sprint, hopefully for a week or even longer. And this is part of what's called a visual braid, where you kind of are creating evidence of your process to remind everyone in the team of why you are where you are. So if these are people's ideas, you kind of have a conversation, you group things together, and you kind of understand what possible areas of solution you might go into in the next phase. Other frameworks that are really helpful here are the future press release. This is something that's very popular, or it was popularized by Amazon, where I worked, and this is where you imagine what if we built a product or a feature or something that in the ideal possible world, what would a press release look like? Where someone writes about what a great feature it was or what a great product it was. And you actually there's a very strong structure that I can share with you if you're curious, but goes through every single phase. It basically ensures that you're thinking through what it is that you're building, and it's a really nice framework. User stories are kind of, part of your bread and butter, hopefully, as a product manager. And this is just something that you will be creating all along as you're defining things. And the typical structure is, as a user type, I want to goal, so that benefit or value. And there are other variants of this, but this is the typical one, and it's probably how you should be thinking during the define stage. Okay, so we've done the first part, and now we're going back into divergent thinking, and that's because we've entered the problem space. So one thing that's very important for this is to brainstorm on your own. So when you enter into divergent thinking, no idea is a bad idea. There are no constraints. This is just about generativity and coming up with as much as you possibly can. So you need to go through the experience yourself so that you can be empathetic to others that you're asking to do this. Crazy Eights is just, a great way to generate ideas fast. You can just get a piece of paper from your photocopier, fold it into 8 pieces, and just get people to write 8 ideas. That's all it is. These are all just things to help people get going. Solution storyboards are wonderful. I love to think in terms of like comic book style flows. But something you can just use Post-it notes. Like I can't draw is not an excuse. You can just put up Post-it notes and kind of describe what's happening generally in the interface of whatever you're building, and it gives people, it forces people to just think very simply about what is actually happening during each phase. And so this is just a nice way to get people going. And then you come back to deciding. So these are some more frameworks that are helpful. Dot voting is probably the most popular thing that I've ever seen. And this is where everyone just, once you've come up with your solutions, everyone sticks a dot on top of their top 3 ideas, and you can kind of see where the interests cluster. Usually there's a decider if there's a problem. So maybe it's the stakeholder or like your your CEO or someone might come in and force a decision if something gets crazy. But these are just frameworks to help you make a decision. Buy a feature can be a fun game. It can kind of it can force you to really, if you have a budget, people start behaving a little bit differently. It depends on your group, but that's a fun way to do it. I also like graphing things. So you can map user value versus feasibility. If your company cares a lot about profit, you could, switch feasibility with profit, for example. But this is a typical one in the design sprint methodology. Okay, so then we get into the third stage, and so this is where we're prototyping. So in a design sprint, it's really typical to do paper prototypes or mock prototypes. Live data prototypes, I think, are amazing because you're using real data, but that usually involves a lot more work on the engineering side. So these tend to help more, and a mock prototype, by the way, is just like a Wizard of Oz approach. Like there's someone behind the curtain actually doing things. So a mock prototype is when you create a simulation, but it's rigged. So a user can be looking at a screen and clicking, but it's not actually wired to anything. There's someone on the back end actually changing, making things happen. So these are kind of like simulations, whereas the third one uses real data, and it's a little more involved, and it depends on how good your engineers are when you're prototyping. That's not true. It depends on how much time you have, how ready your data is, and if people are ready to build really quickly. So validation. Validation is usually a combination of usability tests and stakeholder design reviews, where you're just you're trying to understand if your hypothesis is validated. So that's the design sprint. The discovery sprint is, my reference here is Marty Kagan, who he just wrote a second edition of his book Inspired. You might have heard of this one. And he also champions the design sprint book that I shared with you. But this is someone who has worked at a very high level with a lot of startups. And he talks about the nuances of discovery in a way that I recognized it. When I started reading this book, I had been through those experiences in my own companies, and I just felt like this was really true to my experience, and so it was something that I delved into and wanted to share with you some of the differences. So I'm going to do the same format, but there are going to be some differences here, so I'll just call those out. So what is a discovery sprint? It's like a design sprint. It's a quick, inexpensive way to get to rapid learning, but it really addresses critical risk, okay? Discovery usually happens at a higher level, and what I mean by higher level is it's usually a bigger project, like a redesign, not just one little feature that you're building. And so because it happens at a higher level, risk really has to be evaluated. So you're thinking about the value. Will the customer buy this? Usability. Can the customer figure out how to use it? Feasibility. Can we build it? And business viability. Does this solution work for our business? So these are bigger questions than like a quick design sprint that you can get an answer to with a paper prototype. And so this is for a group that has been through the design sprints and maybe wants to make a bigger change. So in a discovery sprint, you identify a substantial area of risk. You still build tangible solutions. And you validate with customer data. And you involve the entire team. So what are the main differences here? Data. You have to capture data. You have to actually evaluate, while this is quick, you need evidence and data to prove your point because it's a bigger effort and because you probably need to prove this to your CEO or the huge company that you're working for, why whatever you've arrived at is a good idea. And it is still quick and cheap, but it's just higher stakes. So like a design sprint, a discovery sprint can kick off the definition of a product by aligning on a shared vision. It can still help you when you reach an impasse And the reason it helps you is because you're collaborating effectively with all the different stakeholders. And it really gets your team the evidence to fuel your go-to-market plan. So this is more around evidence and data. You use it to rapidly apply learning to address critical product risks. So this picture is a little different. It looks more like an eclipse. And all I'm trying to illustrate here is that you might even build it, you just don't quite launch it. You're trying to learn as fast as you can, but you need to build things out and you need to actually measure with real data. So your cross-functional team is similar. It might include some testers, some more researchers. Since it's focused on a higher risk problem, like executives are usually looped in, and it can, you still need to make it fun, but it's just, who's participating. So we had talked before about, there were these, we talked about the design sprint, and so there's this, the first space is the problem space, where you're understanding and defining. The second space, the solution space, you're kind of ideating and then deciding. And the development one, you're prototyping and validating. In a discovery sprint, it's pretty similar. The difference, the main difference, is that your prototyping and validating phase extends. It's no longer just a development space. It's development and test. And when you're done with the sprint, you can keep testing. And you can keep testing until you get the evidence that you need to actually validate your hypothesis and prove your point. The other difference is that there's this section before that's a little bit sketchy. I'm calling it framing and planning. This is kind of your preparation or your research phase, and this can happen for a really long period of time. Like, the difference is that these are bound. This is like about a week, maybe 2 weeks of work. This can go on for a really long time. You can be researching, planning, learning, and similarly, you can continue to test your idea for a really long time until you get an answer. So that's the main instrumentation difference. Okay, so Marty Kagan, who I like, who I think gives great advice, says that you can do a discovery sprint in 5 days. I've seen it happen, though he recommends that you really extend it to 2 weeks or longer, where that second week is really all about testing. So you might see some different things, so this is your understand and define, your ideate and decide, your prototype. That looks kind of like the design sprint. You see some other things here like recruiting and testing. We'll get into that a little bit more. But this is just a little more beefed up. So just reminding you about this phase for discovery. I guess I called this one prep. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to back this out and explain what's going on in the meantime. So in my mind, in an agile sort of product life cycle situation, you've got your product backlog, whatever it is that you're working on, and you're taking certain bits and kind of planning them into sprints. And those sprints can be a design sprint. It could be like a development sprint. They're usually development sprints. And after this time, you have a period of evaluation. And you basically decide, are you going to launch and learn, or are you going to evaluate your efforts and maybe turn it into a product update that just comes back to your backlog and that you need to evaluate a little bit because you didn't quite get your hypothesis right. That's sort of the background in my mind. I'm actually going to, I don't know. Does anyone have questions about this? I know I'm giving you a lot of information. I can keep going. I have a lot more. But this is making sense? Okay. What I'm going to do now is not bother you with tons of different frameworks. I'm just going to focus on the discovery sprint frameworks beyond design. So I'll just focus on prepping and kind of testing, just to give you a sense of things that you can do to make these fun for your team. And then I'll go through the case study. So framing. I'm just going to go back for a second. That's this section. So this is the extended amount of time that can be, this is a big project. It's probably very important to your product, to your company. Ways to frame. An opportunity assessment is a pretty popular way to go. This is, you have to address and share at least I mean, it can go a lot longer than 4 key points, but you have to know what your target market is. You have to know what your customer problem is. You have to know what your key results are. I'm sure you've heard about OKR or KPI or something. That's what that is. And you really have to know what your business objective is. So this is a kind of formal business way to frame what it is, what your opportunity is, and how you're measuring it before you go into something like this. A fun and modern new way of doing this is the customer letter. This is kind of a modernized version of the press release that I was telling you about earlier. Some people think that the press release model is old because the newspapers don't actually write about products so much anymore, or everything's online, and it's more about feedback these days. So this model is, or this framework is about imagining a happy customer, and it's still a working backwards method, like the future press release. But instead of imagining, what the news says about your product, you imagine reaching out to a customer who really loves what you've done, and what would they say? And then you work backwards from there, and you try to build something to make that customer happy. A startup canvas is another way to go. This is from Lean. This is also pretty involved, and this is the kind of work that you're going to be doing when you're starting a brand new product, really, or a big redesign, and you just need to think about lots of different factors because you're going to have to handle a lot of different stakeholders. So methods to frame, and then methods to plan. So most people, I'd say 85% of the time that I've ever worked in product, I see everybody story mapping. And so I think this is like the typical approach that everyone uses. It's a pretty typical and great way to go. You're basically laying out your major user activities ordered roughly by time from left to right, and then in progressive detail from top to bottom. And you do this just to kind of give a holistic view to everyone of how you're thinking about this. You can draw lines to distinguish between like releases or objectives. What's good about this is it kind of gives stories context. So these are your user stories. And this helps a lot. I don't know if you've had the experience where you're working with engineers and they don't understand, they understand your user story and they'll build something highly specific that doesn't really work holistically into the entire product, and you'll have to go a few rounds with them. This is a great way to show them kind of the larger holistic picture of what it is that you're trying to do and how the one little story that they're working on fits into the bigger picture. And so that's why, and it's part of the visual braid too. This is something that you leave on your wall or you leave somewhere to remind people how what they're working on fits into the bigger picture. This is a much more hardcore way to go. Reference customer, some people call it the reference customer program. I'm calling this reference customer recruiting because in the planning stage you have to actually recruit customers that are going to be your feedback loop as you go through a hardcore discovery sprint. So you're kind of trying to reach out to people, maybe they're already existing users, or depending on where your product is, or if it's a brand new product, you might have to set up certain people that you can actually reach out to them when you have launches to get their feedback, or if you have usability tests, they sort of agree to work with you. This is unbelievably helpful for getting insights later, but it takes a lot to set up. Okay, so we're skipping the design sprint, and now we're going to the prototyping part to talk about the differences in prototyping for a discovery sprint versus a design sprint. So choices that I've seen for prototyping and discovery, I have seen people use the mock prototype, which is similar to the design sprint where it's the Wizard of Oz approach, but this is sort of frowned upon. You have to at least have a feasibility prototype where engineers are essentially writing enough code to mitigate feasibility issues with your product. So, they need to make sure that it's doable, that this thing can be built, and they have to code that up to make sure that, to prove it with evidence. A live data prototype is probably the best way to go here. you understand how the prototype is being used with measurable data. And it's very hard to argue with that. Unless you framed it wrong or you've set up your hypothesis wrong, you actually get data from your live data prototype and you can prove your point, which is wonderful. And validating is, like, there are no pictures here because there are so many things to do, and I couldn't even fit them all on. But essentially, when you're validating, you need to have quantitative value and qualitative value. You probably have to have business viability. You definitely are doing usability tests. You're definitely doing feasibility tests. These are some of the questions that you're trying to ask during this phase, and it's just about, people are going to be looking to you as the product manager to make sure that everything that they've built is, that the hypothesis that you've chosen together is something true and worthwhile and worth doing together for your product and your company. So it's really helpful to have some little things in your pockets and some frameworks to make sure that this happens. Okay, so that was a lot. Maybe I should pause because there's a lot of information here and see if you guys have questions, and if not, I'll just go into the case study. I'm seeing no questions. Okay, then I'll go in. Okay, so, all right, I'm going to tell you a little story. So, have you ever watched a TED Talk and thought, that should be a company? Like, that idea is so cool, it should be a company. I'm starting there because that's what happened in the company that I was working at called Wordnik for this case study that I'm about to share with you. So over there we've got Erin Mccann. She is the former editor-in-chief of the Oxford English Dictionary. She gave an impassioned speech at a TED Talk where she's a lexicographer, and she was talking about how she loves words, and if you really love a word, sort of like the Velveteen Rabbit, you can make it real by using it. And it was her dream to collect all of the words online in English, because she focuses on English, and show all of the ways people use them and interpret them. And an investor named Roger McNamee happened to be sitting in the audience and kind of invited her to come move to Silicon Valley and start a company, and that's what she did. And this was Wordnik. This was the company that she created. It's amazing. This is the company I joined. And it wasn't just an online dictionary. There was a lot going on here. We had a lot of different technologies. We had a corpus of data. We had that we were learning from. We had all of these words, and we had a bunch of computational linguists and machine learning experts. And they were building all kinds of beautiful systems, recommendation systems, language extraction systems. What else? Probably more that I can't think of right now. And when I was hired, they wanted to build a different product, a product that sat on top of Wordnik and used all of its words and its definitions. And they decided they wanted to build a smart reader. And they wanted to, and while we were doing this, we were kind of rebranding. Wordnik became Reverb, and we built a product called Reverb. This was its very first iteration, and the goal at the time was to engage readers in continuous reading. And we were the reason for that is we wanted to create kind of a serendipitous experience. So we imagined things like when you go to a bookstore and you're trying to pick out a book, you might pick out the book that you want, and just by the arrangement or the recommendations of the staff, you might find something serendipitously that's wonderful that you wouldn't have found if you were specifically searching for it. So that was sort of our goal. Our approach was to understand an article's underlying concepts. So we were actually reading the articles that you're reading online, and we were extracting keywords. And then we wanted to bubble them up as topics to explore for further reading. So our implementation is a little bit interesting in the first rep. We embedded 2 sliding carousels at the bottom of your iPad, where these were kind of like the key, so imagine this is like a long article, and these are the keywords that are popping up from the article. And these are more things that you can read at the bottom. So essentially, you could tap on any one of these keywords to refresh the recommendations at the bottom. And those recommendations would sort of, in a very simple sense, it would be like this article plus this idea, say, like call out to all articles everywhere and bring in something similar, and that would be what you find in the recommendations. That was sort of what we were shooting for. But this implementation was a little bit interesting, and well, okay, it was fine for reading. Let's say that. It was fine for reading an article. Okay, so this talk was supposed to be about new feature development. So I was thinking about when the whole team built the collection feature. Okay, so this is really old, but our first idea of the collection, we were basically borrowing the same idea from this continuous reading, and we wanted to create a collection. So I don't want to get too into the weeds here, but I guess all you need to know is, what do you need to know? You need, yes, it looked like Pinterest. Yes, this is old. this is very old, but you're essentially able to, when you collect an article, you would pin it, and you would basically signal to the system that you want more like this. And we would kind of send you fresh batches of recommendations over time. So I'll start there. I think more information will come up later. But I think all that's important to know for this story is we're basically borrowing this model for collections. Okay, so I'm just going to remind you about what we were talking about earlier. And we're basically developing the collection feature. And that's where I'm going to start. So we're at the development sprint. We're developing this new collection feature. We had a feasibility prototype and a live data prototype. And the validation framework, I know I didn't list this earlier. You can really use whatever you want. These are just ideas to, engage your team. Was a competition. We had all these wonderful, basically word nerds working at our company that would have these impassioned conversations about what things meant all the time. And so it seemed like a great way to get everybody involved. So this was a development sprint. We've got a bunch of developers. And we just wanted to learn about the value of the feature. So each day during Scrum, two developers would face off against each other, and they would try to prove that they had a more interesting collection. And the reason we did this, we're not just making this, these have to be measurable. So we measured collections by 3 factors. And sorry, this is the better picture that I wanted to show you. Okay, so depth of concepts. How accurate were the keywords extracted? So these are we would have 10 keywords that were extracted from everything that you've pinned or collected. And this is really important to measure. The breadth of concepts. They need to be broad enough to keep people interested in coming back. And so we needed to make sure that they reflected the interest of all the stories that were saved to a collection. And then finally, the relevance of the recommended reading, which is a difficult thing to measure. We had all kinds of people that were focused on these different areas, and so they got very passionate about it. And it was also sort of a fun way to go through this process. So we evaluated, and during validation, we weren't in great shape. I'll just cut to the chase and say, well, from a feasibility perspective, we noticed that 30% of our concepts that were extracted were woefully off mark. 70%, or 7 out of 10, were excellent, and that was kind of our differentiator. But we were worried about this, and we had to come up, so we were worried about this. We were worried about, in our usability test, sometimes narrow filter bubbles would result from too much signal, and we didn't want to have too narrow of results. And also the concept extraction. If you would save too many articles, it would kind of muddy the waters, and we weren't, you were basically losing your great differentiating terms that was great about our technology. So that's a lot of words to say. Collectors need more control over what determines recommended reading. It wasn't good enough to just pin an article. So another way of saying that is we were lazy. We just, we were sitting around, we were a small startup, and we decided, let's just use we had a designer at the time, and he was really busy. And so we just thought we'd use the same UI for a completely different feature. And these results were not singing enough praises. So another thing that I think I'm just going to pause and talk about this. Well, okay, yeah, I have a ways to go, so I'll come back. Okay, so here we are in our framework. We're evaluating, and we're thinking, you know, I don't think we want to launch this. So we went down to the evaluate and product update phase. We decided not to launch our collection feature. And so we decided to actually have another design sprint because of the problems that I just mentioned. So we started brainstorming. How might we let collectors cultivate a feed with a bit more control? This like pinning articles and just letting the system read and suggest things to you. We wanted to be laid back, but it was too laid back. It was muddying things. So we started thinking about these are actual images we had from our brainstorming. We thought about, okay, is there a way that we can kind of, I was showing you earlier the concepts at the top. Like these were the top 10 extracted words. Is there a way we could pull this down and maybe, you know, this is like broad abstract stuff, but this is where we were at the time. Is there a way we could pull this down and let people play with the concepts? Could we actually like have, one idea was could we have like a plus and a minus area where you actually pull down the ones you don't want and maybe even add new concepts to kind of cultivate your own feed. And yeah, this is a picture of adding your own ideas. And this got a lot of people excited. And so the story was clear. We actually built this thing called edit mode. So this is sort of how it looked at the time. It was a configuration mode to enable collectors to add and remove concepts from their collection. This was our solution that we defined. During validation, we did a lot of usability tests. Basically, the new UI gave collectors enough control to cultivate their interests in a way that reliably yielded recommended reading. Collectors were much more engaged over time when they were rewarded with engaging reading recommendations. That was like a known thing, and that was proved out with some of our quantitative value tests. Also, from a business viability perspective, marketing and sales were all over this tool. They were so excited that you could create collections and that they could actually get in there and be specific about what collections were created. They thought that this would be a great way to spread the word about our new smart reader that we were building. So we were treated, so the validation part was good. And so we decided to launch collections and actually, and we're testing them with real users. At this time we were launched in Canada, and we were also redesigning the entire product for launch again in the US. So while we're launching and learning more about collections, and marketing and sales are using them like crazy, we're thinking about this idea. And we're getting into the redesign phase, and we were thinking about fine-tuning the words that drive your recommendations, because we all experienced this together. We had this shared rapid learning during our design sprint. We wanted to, you know, deepen interest with relevant reading and expand our conceptual vocabulary. Those were things that were important to us. So we did a customer letter, and this was part of the framing. This wasn't exactly what we used, but I'm trying to show you a framework. And during our plan, we did have a reference customer program. And the important thing, I'm not showing you the whole story map because it's crazy and really long, but in our redesign, we realized that we weren't going to build collections for the first release. We didn't have, it was too many features. In our redesign, we were going to start again with just reading, but we knew that we wanted to enable users to fine-tune words that drive recommendations at the highest level. That was a learning we gained from our design sprint. So, from our rapidly applied learning, what we decided to do is incorporate the ability to edit words at the highest level of our product. And this is quite dramatic, and this is a big deal for us, and it means a lot to me, and it probably doesn't mean anything to you. So what I'm showing you is this is like the opening screen of our redesign. This is old. This is from several years ago, but this was a really big deal for us. So essentially, this is a smart reader. There's more. I couldn't fit everything on the screen, but you're essentially exploring the news through words. there's a toggle where you can switch from article view, or we were calling it interests at the time, but these are like the key words from the articles that are interesting to you, and it's a sliding scale. And these are my own personal interests. I could also go to friends, where I could see basically kind of like a word, we call this a word wall, but it's basically a scroll of the words that define all of the stories or articles that are shared by your Facebook and Twitter friends, which is a really cool way to explore and navigate, we thought. Or you could go to News View, and it's the same thing. So you could look at just articles, or if you want to sort of expand your vocabulary or get a quick glimpse at what's going on, you can actually look at words, and you would tap this word to see articles about it and to see all the recommended reading. And so this is a design solution, but what I'm trying to show you with this is that our shared learning with our tiny little team and a tiny little startup, from a sort of failed development sprint that turned into a design sprint, actually affected our product at the highest level. This was our opening screen. It was just from an insight that we learned together, and we thought was important enough that we wanted to show it at the very beginning of our product. It affected our company. This was an award-winning app. We were #1 in the news space, so we were featured by the App Store. This was sold to Inform, which is a huge news company. And I think what I want to share with you today is that it's so exciting when you build an idea from scratch, right? That's where I started. It's so much more exciting when you bring your team along, when everyone shares these learnings and are thinking about them from different perspectives, and they keep thinking about them, and you collect the data and the evidence you need to prove out what you all think is the right hypothesis. It actually makes it back into your product. It makes the whole product better. It makes the whole company better. And I think that's what a good discovery sprint is about. And that was, I'm trying to describe one experience I had. I've had several more that I'm happy to talk about if you want. But the most important thing about this is just making sure that everyone in your company, everyone in your team is aligned on the goal and knows why you're doing what you're doing. So I think that's what I have to, yep. So if I had to share some tips with you, find ways to engage your team. That's what I'm trying to share with you right now. Frameworks, right? None of them are a silver bullet. This is really about providing some kind of structure when you've got all kinds of talented, bright people from different disciplines working together. It helps to have a plan and a structure. You don't have to be super rigid about it, but they're looking to you for some of this. Ideas come from everywhere. Just find ways to engage everybody. Competition might work in your case, or one of these other frameworks I named. As a product manager, you need to acknowledge these ideas that come from everywhere, and I think in my experience the best way to acknowledge ideas is to connect the what to the why. People have all these what ideas. Why? Why something is important is a great way. If you can get people to articulate why something is important, you can help your whole team articulate reasons that you use for prioritization in the future. This can feed into your business objectives. This can be, but most importantly, people know why they're building things and they see the bigger picture, and they're able to pan out from their highly specific view of your product. And finally, you just should reflect and learn. If you don't act on your insights, you're not going to evolve. And I think, had we not acted on our insight about our strange way of, allowing users to control their feed, basically helped us make some service flow changes that enabled us to really show off our technology, which was this word extraction technology, to the world. So you need to hold on to those shared insights and use them, and maybe you will make a differentiating product. And that's all I have to say for now. So are there questions now? Yeah, hey.
Hey, I think you touched on it a bit. I can't remember if you went into detail, but specifically in a design sprint, but other sprints as well, where this might apply, when you're choosing a sprint master or moderator.
Oh, right, sorry.
Any tips for that? Because it's not supposed to be the process.
Yeah, okay, so usually the sprint master is, if you're lucky enough to have like a UX designer, they're usually quite skilled at this. I've also seen engineering managers lead. The reason you don't, you need kind of a sprint master to lead this is because as the product manager, you need to contribute. You need to be there with your group, coming up with ideas, putting them on the wall, thinking together. If you're driving, you're not participating. And so usually it's your UX lead, but it's someone who's, you're going to partner with them, you're going to come up with some of these ideas, but they're going to be the ones kind of, grouping together the Post-it notes. They're going to be the ones drawing, so that you can be ideating with everybody else. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. What about, and this might be the same thing, but a decider as well?
Yeah.
Someone saying, like, we're going with this idea, next step. Is that separate than a Scrum or a Sprint Master?
Yeah, so, okay, let me, sometimes you'll have some highly opinionated, passionate people and you're in a bit of a standoff, even if you're in a design sprint or a discovery sprint. Basically, there's some great ideas and no one can narrow down on what the right one is. So, maybe the dot voting doesn't work. I've seen forced voting where people can only vote once. I've even seen that end up at a standoff. And so usually at that point, your CEO steps in or your founder steps in and they might have a deciding vote. It's really helpful to plan this stuff out ahead of time so that people don't feel like they've just spent 3 days or 5 days of their job life doing something that doesn't lead to a decision. So just have that in your pocket in case an impasse comes up, or if you're really worried about it, use some kind of framework where it's much more pointed and a decision will come up more naturally. Thank you guys. Yeah.